Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. Today I want to talk about a tricky little concept about historical manuals which we rarely consider and that we should instead take in high consideration while interpreting our sources. People had to train their actions. Now you are probably thinking, Federico, this sounds kind of obvious. Well, let me tell you something. Be it fencing or life, it is precisely behind the thin veil of obvious that, sometimes, some important truth remains hidden and unnoticed. Martial arts and also great part of military history are all about training, because it is only training and training alone which puts the human in the conditions to use the tools, techniques and tactics under great stress with the goal to face and eventually survive combat. But training has some really important boxes that needs to be checked to actually work as intended. First of all, it has to be repeatable, which means it needs to be organized and planned so to be useful. Second, it has to be safe enough to avoid the most problematic injuries so to not break Rule 1. And third, it has to be as close as reality as possible while not breaking Rule 2 and thus Rule 1 with it. Achieving good training is not that easy, because as weapons are meant to kill and maim, to check our three boxes we need to modify something. And both nowadays and back in the days, we only have and had a few tools to obtain these goals, which I'm now going to list. The first one is technology. And this is by far the lesser important point while talking about the period I'm mainly focusing on and talking about, which spans from 14th to 16th century. It is instead the most relevant today. Technology makes humans able to modify the weapons and add the level of protection needed to perform certain actions safely and regularly. The most important achievements we had in training thanks to technology compared to the 14th and 15th century especially is the ability to thrust on target and to hit the hands with proper intention and speed without incurring in major risks. Something easy to get by observing the manuals, as we will see later. But remember, as far as technology may help a lot, it modifies the fighting approach as any other method which I will list later. An easy example outside of HEMA is boxing and boxing gloves, for instance. The second is modifying technique. This may be a choice or a consequence brought by other artifacts. Modifying technique is a way to perform an action at the proper distance while not being dangerous to the training partner. This can be done by applying control to a cut or by landing a thrust off target. It is possible to see plenty of these things in the manuals, which we will see later. Outside of HEMA, it is possible to see this concept applied quite commonly in the greatest majority of traditional martial arts, where control is applied to stop a punch or strike before hitting, both in armed and unarmed context of application. The third method is modifying distance, and this may be considered the same thing or an alternative to the previous method, and it is extremely relevant in our context in the case of thrusting, which has different pros and cons. The technique is landed on target this time, but the attack stops 10 or 20 centimeters away from the target. This is easy to see in many HEMA treaties, as we will see. Outside of HEMA, this is a very common safety tool in traditional martial arts, especially the armed ones. When I trained Jodo back in the days, I observed this safety method applied in a more or less conscious way while thrusting both with the Jo, which is the short stick, and the katana. The fourth is modifying speed. The speed of an action can be modified to either make it safer or, for neophytes especially, easy to learn. This is something we find in our modern practice too, as these tools has many applications. It has probably been one of the main safety tools of our ancestors while practicing certain techniques in certain contexts, but is at the same time the hardest to observe, let's say, while reading our techniques, if not impossible to find out, actually. even if it is easy to see where it may have been applied through deduction, basically. The fifth is modifying rhythm, and this is something very specific which I wanted to list even if it is not related to our HEMA context of application, if not maybe in a modern sense. It is easy instead to observe in Filipino martial arts, for instance. The tool modifies the rhythm at which a technique and a counter are landed to build up flow drills. This safety tool helps increasing the application speed of a technique and its repeatability. After listing them, I want to show you a few examples of how it is quite easy sometimes to spot this kind of safety methods applied in training on our manuals. In fact, even if there are some exceptions which are meant to show real combat, such as in Talofer, for instance, which is not really a manual anyway, the greatest majority of images tend to show training applications. Not always, of course. In fact, to an extent, the images on the manuals resembles the photos and drawings you may find on a modern self-defense book. Some of them represent training, some of them application, and everything is done in a more or less organic way, as it is clear that you don't want to stick a finger into an eye of someone while training. Certain things nowadays, as well as back in the days, are just taken for granted. Anyway, let's start by the 133. This book has some of the most variegated and interesting approaches to training ever, in my opinion, which are easy to spot and understand with enough martial knowledge. Let's start by the falling under. The falling under is, in my opinion, a rare European example of a way of landing strikes which we find on the other side of the planet in Japanese martial arts. In the translation of the Heiho Kadensho, The Sword That Brings Life, made by William Scott Wilson, we find a very interesting mention of an ancient training method, where he explains the improvement brought by the Fukuroshinai, namely technology, over the bokken. While using the Fukuroshinai, the swordsmen were able to hit each other as if they were fighting for real. This wasn't possible with the stiff bokken instead. With this, in fact, the blow had to be struck sumeru by hitting the opponent's sword, or by hitting the base of the opponent's guard. He then goes on saying that because this method was relatively risky anyway, most schools practiced only katas, which were even less realistic. That hitting the sword at the base of the opponent's guard, which to me sounds as hitting the strong of the blade, instantly reminded me of the falling under. In fact, while applied as a hand or forearm snipe, which provokes a sword parry, most of the options listed after the various applications of the falling under make far more sense. This is the first hint who brought me to think in regards of training terms, rather than fighting terms. But this is just an example. The 133 is full of blows landed with control, or thrusts landed out of target, or again, thrusts landed without hitting the target, as a mean to work out a counter. This last example is generally executed by already starting in Langort, so with extended arms, in such a way that the control over distance while landing the offensive action is easier to apply, making the action far more safe. While looking at the 133 with training in mind as the main filter between manual and application, we may find all that artifacts and methods used to apply to training in an environment which was lesser safe and technologically developed compared to our standard training methods nowadays. And so by identifying these artifacts, it is possible to conceive an interpretation which better fits our possibilities of application in a modern context. Or if we desire the radical opposite, we can recreate the training method of the past by abandoning modern technology to experiment on how it felt and what skill it brought or didn't brought to train in a way which most probably resembled the original one. Now let's move on to Fiore. Fiore's exchange of thrust and punta falsa punta curta are two extremely useful examples to understand how training influences the manuals. The exchange of thrust, just by reading the name, is clearly meant as a way to train an action on tempo, but is landed as a parry riposte. Even more, a parry riposte which, to land the riposte, has to land two different stepping motions. And if we want to go to stretto and grab the opponent handle, we have to land another passing step. In total, one accresor, namely a step sideways, and two passing steps forward. And we were the one receiving the attack, not attacking. There is no need to land these steps, save for the sideways one, maybe, to deliver the scambiare, if the opponent is going to land the thrust properly, namely by trying to pass through our figure. Instead, if the thrust is delivered with control and stops before hitting us, then the footwork is needed to complete the exercise in the correct way. Also, by looking at the images of the scambiare itself on the Getty manual, we see how the defender carefully lands the thrust to the neck of the training partner, keeping the weight backward instead of forward to decrease the chance to hurt the partner. In my own interpretation of it, I even suggest that the failed scambiare is not only meant to train a solution to an error, but is also another way to train the thrust. The first one lands the action on target with control. The second lands it out of target by reaching proper depth, to triangulate the real outcome of such kind of action. The punta falsa punta curta is another example. The name is fake thrust, short thrust, but it starts with a mezzano, a horizontal blow, and then lands the short thrust in half swording. The motivation is quite simple. While training it in an unarmored context, which is the case in the section the punta falsa punta curta is actually explained, landing a thrust toward the face is extremely risky, even by using a stick. A mezzano toward the head replicates the exact crossing geometry and ending position of a high thrust toward the head, but it is easier to control as it comes from out of the figure of the opponent. So modifying the action in this way was necessary, but the name had to be kept. Fake thrust, short thrust, to describe the real application of the action. Notice that the difference here is that this thrust is offensive. Training an offensive thrust is riskier, fun enough, than training a defensive stop thrust. If this is not enough to convince someone anyway, Fiore says that the action is better in armor than without armor. And who fights in armor knows well that a direct thrust to the visor will stimulate a parry, most probably, while a direct mezzano with a sword at the helmet, for as strong as it may be, will not necessarily stimulate the same effect. The German masters are another example. The Absetzen, which is clearly our counter of tempo in this context, is again another parry riposte landed by stepping forward. Spoiler alert, if someone is thrusting at you and you exchange the thrust, the opponent stabs his own person. Steps aren't needed to complete the action, if not for gaining enough balance once the target has already been hit. But the glossa of Ringeg, Danzig and Liu is kind of clear in these regards. It is not a consequence. The step is meant to reach the target, actually. The reason is simple. Training artifacts to actually make training possible. Other actions needed lesser artifacts, and in fact are closer to their actual application than others. But still, we find here and there habits which suggest higher care in relation to the use of the thrust, especially in certain given conditions, especially while aiming for the neck and face in general. The Zornhau is described as a parry riposte on two tempi, but the description may also suggest an application on tempo. Again, we can relate to the exchange of thrusts, this time by the aspect of transforming a scary and risky action on tempo in a parry riposte, which is easier to train and thus safer. Another example is the Schilhau, in which the strike is landed in different ways following Ringek, Danzig and Liu. Ringek seems to choose the shoulder as a target for the Hue, which is a far safer target if you think about it. Danzig seems to strike above over the sword to the head, which suggests some form of control or even protection. Liu instead describes the action in a way which feels as there is more space from the very beginning between the two fences. He even advises to jump forward and sideways while defending. In fact, the Hue seems to end directly in front of the face or chest of the opponent. Of course, this, as most of our interpretive work, is some sort of speculation, but is based on my knowledge of traditional and modern martial arts training environments, which I am frequenting and studying since 13 years now. In many cases, I found solid hints or proof that the action had been described in a way which helped the execution in training. Other times, this is debatable, while in others, the action seems to fit the application context. But again, while talking about application context, I talk about my experience, meaning our nowadays application context and not fighting. So, chance is that some actions were trained in the same way as we do today, more or less. Others had to be trained in other ways, simply to avoid certain risks, such as for the action on tempo we have seen described above. And others, again, were almost not trained at all, such as what we call hand sniping. And not because hand sniping wasn't effective enough. Most probably instead quite the contrary, as my fingers can testimony thanks to when we used it to fence with lacrosse gloves many years ago. So yeah, this is one of those videos in which I want to make you aware of something which I consider kind of big and important. I don't have all the answers, as always, but I want to help you asking yourself the right questions, which will not only make your life easier while interpreting the old manuals, but will also make the techniques stored in them far more relevant in our modern context of application, as by understanding what differs in training, we can compensate and adapt them as needed. Very good, people. I hope you will find this video useful in some ways. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to check my Patreon link in the description if you want to support me. Remember that HEMA and martial arts with it are my main job. So if you decided to support me, I will be extremely grateful. Thanks for watching as always, and see you next time.